Hello, my loves, and welcome back to Fluffenhammer Adjacent, not the Ages of Chaos this time. I know that chaos tends to preoccupy us on this channel because, well, chaos is my jam. It really is. I love everything about chaos in the 41st millennium. I love the metaphysics that it provides. I love the sort of extreme reflection of humanity that you get in the chaos powers and their demons and whatnot. It's actually much deeper than its sort of hobby tabletop miniatures game roots would suggest. There's a lot going on there. There's a lot of fun to be had, and a hell of a lot of depth to be dredged up from the otherwise, the more lurid or florid or aesthetic elements. I really like that. And don't get me wrong, I really like the lurid, florid and aesthetic elements too, because those are very beautiful, especially where Zeesh and Slaanesh are concerned. But no, today I really want to, since we're heading into Warhammer 40,000's 10th edition, what I really want to talk about is one of the other horror aspects of the 41st millennium, one which is counterpointed to chaos in many respects, and it does demonstrate the variety and depth of horror that one can find in settings like this. One of the fun things about the Warhammer 40,000 setting is that it is so open. It's so... There's so much florid potential in it to explore different aspects of mythology and of art and of concepts, and one of those is horror. And there are many and varied forms of horror in the 41st millennium. You know, you have almost Lovecraftian metaphysical horror in chaos, but you also have things like, for example, the Necrons, which represent an entirely other style of horror. You also have the Drukhari, which once again are their own peculiar style. In fact, within the Drukhari, there are myriad different forms and species of horror. You have the overt sadism of, for example, the Kabbalites, but you also have the body horror, the almost cenobitical surgical horror represented by the homunculi. So even within a particular race or army or species, there are variations and layers and levels of significance, which I really love. But what I want to talk about today are the Tyranids. Since we are heading into Warhammer 40,000's 10th edition and the big boxed set, which, yes, I did manage to bag a pre-order of, Leviathan, represents the return of the Tyranids to the 41st millennium. I thought it might be fun to have a look at them. They are, so I mean, at base level, the Tyranids they're kind of emblematic of what Warhammer 40,000 started as, and Warhammer 40,000 started as this giant grab bag of other IPs and other ideas. You've got elements of, like, huge elements just cribbed directly from, for example, 2000 AD, from Michael Moorcock, from Lovecraft, from The Lord of the Rings, from all over the shop. There are so many different elements that are just drawn into the Warhammer 40,000 universe to make it what it is, deriving from too many sources, really, to go into specifically. The Tyranids they are the xenomorph. Originally, they are the HR Giga alien. That's within the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Way back when, way back when, at the very beginning of Warhammer 40,000, the original Tyranid was almost like it was just like a side reference, really. It wasn't one of the established races. Back in Rogue Trader, which is the original version of Warhammer 40,000, there was a vague picture in the original Rogue Trader rulebook, background book rather, that just described a Tyranid, and that Tyranid entity was what would eventually become known as a termagant, which are the small sort of swarm warrior organisms that are the mainstay of the Tyranid forces, but they are, by and large, derivations of HR Giga's xenomorph, in the same way that what would become the Gene Stealers are. Now, the Gene Stealers are interesting because originally they aren't part of the Tyranid race. They are actually their own separate entity, which was going to be developed into its own thing at some point. A little later on, after Rogue Trader, they were redesigned and they were made to dovetail with the Tyranids. They were actually made into like a vanguard organism for the Tyranid swarms. The Tyranids in and of themselves are alien biological horror. They're the horror of evolution, of life that operates outside of the parameters and restrictions that we know of on Earth. They kind of represent, in the same way that a lot of H.R. Giger's artwork does, in the same way that the Xenomorph from Alien does, they represent very animal horrors and fears. It's that fear that we have when we encounter wasps or scorpions or snakes or spiders. That's what the Tyranids represent. But they are driven into, like everything in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, they are absolutely extreme. They are entities that derive from outside of the known galaxy. Nobody knows where they come from or what their origins are, but they move in these gigantic spacefaring swarms across the universe, and when they descend on a world that has biomass or that even has things like minerals or oceans or chemicals, anything like that, they descend upon it, they strip it of all biological matter, they devour all biological matter and take it back to their hive fleets. And their fleets are not spaceships as we would understand them. They are not creations, they're not artifacts, they're living creatures. They're gigantic mother organisms that spawn the various lesser Tyranid organisms in their wombs, in their bodies. And when they retrieve all of that biomass, the Tyranids themselves are dissolved, and all of that biological information is absorbed into the wider Tyranid species, and they use that information to create new adaptations, new bioforms. So they're endlessly and very rapidly evolving in response to any threats that they face or any defense that their prey organisms come up with. And so they are mindless horrors. There is an intelligence behind them, but it's not an individual intelligence. No individual Tyranid organism is intelligent per se or sapient in the way that we would understand it. They're all driven by a collective consciousness called the hive mind, and nobody knows really what that is. Whether it's like, say, like the Chaos Powers, where it's like a collective entity coalesced in the warp from the Tyranids, or whether it's something else. One thing we do know is that it's so horrifying what they call it, the shadow in the warp, the hive mind. It's so horrifying that even the Chaos Powers are afraid of it. The reason they're afraid of it is wherever it spreads, it becomes the warp. Because, of course, the Tyranids have none of the drives or the passions or the abstractions that foment the warp and give rise to the Chaos Powers and feed them. They don't have any of that. They're animals, effectively. So it has this effect of sterilizing the warp. And if it spreads too far, it could potentially smother and overshadow the Chaos Powers. This has led some players, and certainly even some characters in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, to theorize that the Tyranids may be like a bioweapon. They may be something created by some outside entity, maybe the Old Ones, maybe one of the ancient races from the Warhammer 40,000 universe, as a weapon against chaos, right? The way you destroy chaos is by becoming the warp, and the only way of becoming the warp is by devouring every sentient race, every race and species that has something approaching an imagination in creation. And that's what the Tyranids represent. It's hard to know what their ultimate aim is other than consuming everything, because that's what they do. They descend on worlds, they consume them, leave them so arid and so lifeless that even the possibility of life can never occur again. They even absorb like the chemical elements from rocks and minerals and things. I mean, some worlds that they attack just come apart because they've got no integrity left, and then they move on. then they just move on. They are not. I mean, I know I said that they individually they're animals, but as a collective species, they're not. It's more appropriate to regard each swarm, each hive fleet, and each individual Tyranid entity as an organ or a cell within one gigantic creature. That makes more sense. It's like some galactic Lovecraftian Leviathan is reaching its tendrils into the universe, and it's a threat to everyone and everything. They are a kind of unknowable, unreasoned cosmic horror that nevertheless taps into something very fundamentally human in terms of what makes them horrifying, and that is, of course, survivalism. It's that survivalist imperative you feel when you're faced with something dangerous, something that may have once been dangerous in our evolutionary past, like spiders and snakes and things, or things that are dangerous now. That's what they tap into. There's also other forms of horror within the Tyranids. There's the body horror element of them. So the background of the Tyranids, the books, the codices, often goes into really deep detail on how they are cultivated and how they operate. So you've got Tyranid organisms that are their weapons are living organisms. They're weapon symbiotes that are parts of the Tyranid organism that bears them. They're symbiotically linked. So the imperatives of both organisms act in concert together, and in some instances, those symbiote organisms, the weapon organisms, actually control the entity that bears them. And that reflects certain similar relationships that exist within the animal kingdom or within nature. It kind of brings to mind certain symbiotic relationships, like, for example, those that exist between the entities that comprise jellyfish. You know, jellyfish are not single organisms. That's one of the weird things about them. They are collective organisms. Every biological mechanism in a jellyfish is actually a separate creature, but acting in a symbiotic whole. The same is true of the Tyranids. You've got weapon symbiotes that can override the imperatives of the organism that carries them and make them do things that they otherwise wouldn't do. It's really fascinating. You've also got this thing where they are driven, the swarms, the hives are driven by synaptic entities, which are the bigger, more intelligent, more sort of costly entities to produce for the hive fleets. They're called synapse entities, and they act as nodes for the hive mind, and they spread their imperatives across the swarms. If one of those isn't present, then very often the lesser organisms revert to animal instincts, which can be problematic for the swarms. But that's what they are. They are fascinating entities, and a lot has been done with them to kind of evolve them away from their xenomorph roots, although that is always going to be there. That HR Giga element is always going to be there because that's what they are. They are the horror of flesh and life, I suppose. Life run rampant, life without parameters. That's what they are. And it's quite cool. There's something wonderfully unknowable and yet horrifyingly familiar about the Tyranids. The way they've designed, the miniatures range for the Tyranids has gone through multiple shifts and changes, but what they're always looking at these days is how do these things operate in evolutionary terms. So if you look at the Tyranid miniatures that currently exist, they're all related to one another. They all look like they are derived from one another. So you've got, for example, creatures that are called gargoyles, and they are winged entities. And if you look at them in comparison to the termagants, the foot troops, you can see that they are evolutions or adaptations of the termagant. Their wings are hyper-specialized limbs. It's really, really clever. There are these burrowing snake-like organisms called raveners, and if you look at those in comparison to these large synapse creatures called Tyranid warriors, they are clearly adaptations of the basic Tyranid warrior that have evolved to burrow underground and perform a particular function. It's really, really cool. You see that with the weaponry as well. All of the weaponry are these very icky, unpleasant, organic engines or machines that often have like eyes sculpted into them and things like that. Like one of the Tyranid weapons is called a flesh borer, and the flesh borer is a giant organic hive that produces these flesh-eating beetles that the weapon shoots at the Tyranids' enemies. They burrow through armor and clothing and into the body beneath, and they eat them from the inside out. It's really, 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 really nasty and unpleasant. A lot of the Tyranid weapons are like that. They have this really hideous biological horror thing going on where they spit corrosive acid, or there's one called the Barbed Strangler, and it shoots this living seed pod that rapidly evolves as it fires through the air, and when it lands, it's this whipping mass of tendrils with barbs on them that lash out and attack everything around it. It's very, very nasty indeed. And having looked at them in 10th, I mean, I've looked at the index for them in 10th, and I've got to say they're great. They're really, really good. In terms of their representation on the battlefield, they've really gone to town with them. Obviously, they wanted to make them one of the key races this time round, since they are at the core of the opening narrative for 10th. Basically, they've returned. The Hive Fleet Leviathan, one of the biggest Hive Fleets in existence, has returned, and it's bigger and badder than ever, and it's pressing like not just the Imperium but every race in the 40k galaxy to breaking point. It's really cool. It's really fun. It brings things to a nice sort of knife edge where if the Tyranids win, which they won't, but if the Tyranids like won out, then that would be it. Everything would be over. So you've got this really wonderful fraught situation, which is where the 40k universe often is. You know, it's how it operates. It's always on a knife edge, you know. But in the midst of that, all the other races are kind of scrabbling around, pursuing their own agendas, trying to defend themselves, being forced to fight alongside the other races that they hate or that they have major grudges with in order to survive. So that's a lot of fun. It just introduces some nice narrative tensions. But they clearly wanted the Tyranids to be significant in this edition, and their index is amazing. I've got to say, I mean, I'll talk about it more when we get into it, but the indices that they've released for 10th edition are the most complete army lists, like get you by army lists that are released at the beginning of every edition have ever been. They are the most complete, they are the most complex, the most interesting, and it's a great, I mean, if this is the way it's going to go moving forward, then brilliant, absolutely brilliant, because this is wonderful. The Tyranids were very good in 9th, in fact they were one of the killer armies in 9th, and they are very, very, very good in 10th as well. Their army-wide special rules are amazing. They have a Shadow in the Warp ability, which basically allows them to impose battle shock tests on every unit in the enemy army at one point in the game. Now, in previous editions of the game, that wouldn't have been all that much, because morale and whatnot didn't really mean much back then. This time round, it really does. That can change the game. If the Tyranid player is on the hot foot, if they're losing, if they're not holding objectives and whatnot, it can be a game changer if played at the right time. It's an absolutely brilliant special rule. Also, to represent their sort of adaptability, they have they have exactly that. They have this ability to adapt at the beginning of, is it every game turn? I think it's maybe at the beginning of the battle, it may be at the beginning of every game turn, I'm going to have to look that up, but it means that they can get certain capabilities to represent what they would be evolving or what they would be doing in that given situation. It's really cool. It's really cool. They've also got a lot of lovely synergies with their characters and their troops and swarms. It's really good. Loads of new stuff as well. Loads of some of the best Tyranid miniatures they have ever released, many of which are in this Hive Fleet Leviathan box set, by the way. The Neurothrope is one of my favourite Tyranid organisms ever released. I've got a thing about the big psychic beasts in Warhammer 40,000, and this thing, it's a giant Lovecraftian jellyfish. It's great. It's a big brain with tendrils and armour and it's absolutely wonderful. It looks like it could come out of a HR Giga drawing, which is fantastic. Give me all of that. please. So I'm very pleased. I'm very pleased with where things are going. I'm very pleased with the way the Tyranids are being represented after being fairly neglected for quite a few editions of the game. Let's be honest, they are one of those races that's needed an update for a long time, and now it looks like it's actually happening. So yeah, I mean, the other miniature that's really done it for me, which is sadly not in the Leviathan box set, is the new Death Leaper. The Death Leaper is an amazing Tyranid organism. It looks, again, it's very much an adaptation of Giga's Xenomorph with some Lovecraftian elements like the Cthulhuoid mouth tentacles thrown in. It's got like the skirt. You know how some squids have skirts between their tendrils? It has that around its waist with these barbed tendrils and a skirt of flesh. It is absolutely beautiful, that creature. Easily one of the best Tyranid miniatures ever released. Ever released. Beautiful thing. I'm so happy with where the Tyranids are at the moment, and the fact that because they're so cool, then they're one of the cooler races in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. You're going to get a lot of new players. You're going to get a lot of people picking them up now. And just because you're getting them in the boxed set, obviously, people are going to want to buy them. They're going to want to expand and make their own little hive fleet, which is great. It's really nice to see. When we come back, my lads, I'm going to be taking a look at the indices for the various Chaos forces in the Ages of Chaos, because I've got to do that, haven't I? I'm almost contractually obliged. It's going to be fun. It's going to be very enthusiastic, and I can tell you that now, because I'm really pleased with all of them. I like them all, I'll be honest. So, until next time, bye-bye!